Hey scholars, welcome to this week's review session. We're looking at the Barron's book, chapter 5, looking at natural biogeochemical cycles, basically the nutrient cycles that we took a look at earlier. The first one we're going to take, let me list them off for you. The carbon cycle, the hydrologic cycle, the sulfur cycle, phosphorus cycle, and then also the nitrogen cycle, which is, I think, sulfur and nitrogen are probably the most two heavily tested cycles out of the five. So let's take a look at it first, and we'll start with the carbon cycle first. Again, it is kind of the carbon cycle goes hand in hand with photosynthesis and also respiration. So those are our two natural things as far as the balance between where carbon is at, either in the atmosphere or held up into biological sinks or holds in the ecosystem. So let's take a look at it. First of all, we have carbon is the basic building block for all life forms. Makes up carbohydrates, fats, proteins, nucleic acids, and it's a big exchange amongst all the different spheres: the biosphere, geosphere, hydrosphere, and atmosphere. It goes hand in hand with all those. Carbon is found in rocks. It is a very minor component with the mass of either oxygen or silicon atoms in rocks. So it's not a huge portion of rocks, but it can be found in rocks. It is also found as carbon dioxide, which makes up only less than 1% of the Earth's atmosphere. And we'll come back to this image in just a second. So the major reservoirs or sinks for carbon, as far as being held out of the atmosphere, are plant matter. So plants, through the process of photosynthesis, the equation for photosynthesis, you'll definitely need to know that. Should be a review for you from biology. They produce carbon in the form of organic molecules like carbohydrates, and therefore store those as tissue material of the plant. Also found in terrestrial biospheres, freshwater systems have both non-living and organic material included in those, and carbon can be stored for several hundred years in trees and up to thousands of years in soil if in the soil. So it's a nice sink for carbon. Oceans can also be a sink for carbon. It can be dissolved as inorganic in the form of CO2 in the water. It also can be held in the shells and skeletons of organisms. And also, again, actually the ocean is accumulating 2 gigatons of carbon each year of holding on to it. So most of it's not involved with that rapid exchange of the atmosphere as far as CO2 goes, but more wrapped up in organisms themselves. Now, removing carbon dioxide actually raises the pH, making water more basic, which leads to coral bleaching, which maybe we've talked about already. But those are another sink, oceans. And then finally, sedimentary deposits, where obviously all those organisms die. Their shells, fall to the bottom. Their bodies fall to the bottom, which have that carbon in them, and then it ends up becoming layers of the ocean sediment, and then obviously piling up over the years, becoming sedimentary deposits. So those are the major sinks for carbon itself, and it actually can be released back into the atmosphere. Here's some of the equations too, by the way, of looking at sedimentation, weathering, metamorphosis, how it kind of all transfers out as far as calcium and carbon. And you'll notice that calcium carbonate and calcium silicon oxide and things like that are all wrapped up. There are some larger molecules, but again, the root is carbon. Carbon is released back in the atmosphere through a couple of different things: through respiration, through organisms, plants, and animals respiring, and as CO2 is a byproduct of that reaction, there's the reaction for the respiration side of respiration equation. Again, the flip of the equation for photosynthesis. And when oxygen is not present, anaerobic respiration actually releases methane gas, which still has carbon in it. There's the C for methane, CH4, so still releases that. Also, decaying of organic material. As anything decays, bodies break down. Again, a byproduct of it is methane gas, and that contains more carbon. So that is then entering the atmosphere with a different chemical compound of methane, but still carbon itself. Burning fossil fuels is probably our biggest human component. Wood and coal and so on also has a combustion reaction, releases CO2 as a byproduct, and therefore goes in the atmosphere. Weatherization of rocks, and especially the erosion of limestone, marble, and chalk. And there's that weathering, calcium, silicon oxide, breaking back down into those components, just a decomposition reaction and releasing those accordingly. Volcanic eruptions also produce some CO2 in the atmosphere, and then release of carbon dioxide by the warming of ocean water as global warming occurs. Colder water holds more gases, and therefore cannot hold on to that CO2 in its gaseous state and then release it to the atmosphere. So those are our 6 methods of carbon returning to the atmosphere. Again, there's some sinks in how long it can actually, how much it can hold as far as carbon itself, and there's the in metric tons, billions of metric tons, the amount of carbon that each of these areas can hold that we talked about earlier. All right, so that's one cycle. That's the carbon cycle, kind of a well-known. You kind of covered that in biology, but let's take a look at the nitrogen cycle. Probably one of the more complex of the cycles, the most complex of them all, and also heavily tested question probably for the most part. I just know from experience that they give a lot of information on nitrogen, so therefore it's probably going to be tested on the more information you got about it. So. Nitrogen makes up 78% of the atmosphere. So when I describe the cycle of nitrogen, I usually start with the atmosphere because that's where a majority of it's found, well, at least as far as the percentage goes of atmosphere. Nitrogen is also an essential element making of amino acids and proteins and also nucleic acids, and also stores organic matter in the soil and oceans, so it is stored that way too. The natural cycle of nitrogen, in which atmospheric nitrogen is converted to nitrogen oxides by lightning, and also by deposit in the soil by rain, where it is assimilated by plants, either eaten by animals or decomposed back into nitrogen by bacteria, including the following processes. So this little description right here of the whole cycle happens because of these different terms. The first one is nitrogen fixation, which we'll talk about in a second, nitrification, and then also assimilation, ammonification, and denitrification. We'll go over each of those today. But nitrogen fixation, let's just say that for all intents and purposes, and I think the newer edition of this book has a better image of this all, has more of a pictorial image of it all. Let's say that nitrogen starts out in the atmosphere. It starts out as nitrogen N2 gas, a diatomic element, and when it is converted by bacteria, for the most part, it is converted into either NH3, which is ammonia, or nitrate, NO3. That's nitrogen fixation. That's the basic chemical process of it. But nitrate is a product of high energy fixation by lightning. Like I said, lightning can do it. Cosmic radiation or meteorite trails, which is kind of crazy to think about, but most of it's probably by lightning. And high energy fixation, atmospheric nitrogen and oxygen combine to form nitrates, which are carried to the Earth's surface by rainfall, which is a good thing. Now, that's nitrogen fixation, but nitrogen fixation also happens at the roots itself. We'll talk about that in a second. In contrast, it says biological fixation accounts for 90% of the fixed nitrogen in the cycle. So, just by this natural process, we're going to look at in a second, that's by biological, it means living things breaking down. So lightning, it doesn't happen all the time. It's not bringing that much fixation out, but it can a little bit. What really happens, 90% of it is biological fixation, happens at the roots of plants. So in biological fixation, molecular nitrogen N2 is split into 2 free nitrogen atoms. The nitrogen atoms then combine with hydrogen to yield ammonia. Now, this happens with a series of different microorganisms. It says right here, the symbiotic relationship of rhizobium is associated with the roots of legumes, which are types of plants. To a lesser extent, some non-leguminous plants also exhibit some symbiotic relationships with bacteria, and some free-living aerobic bacteria like Azobacter and Clostridium freely fix nitrogen in the soil as well. Also, blue-green algae, aka cyanobacteria, such as nostoc and calothrix, can also fix nitrogen both in the soil and in the water, yielding ammonia as the stable end product. Now, that's a good thing. Nitrogen fixation is key. It's getting it from the atmosphere to some sort of usable form that could be absorbed by the plants. Okay? Now, that happens by lightning, and also by different types of soil bacteria, mostly around the legumes of plants. Okay? Now, nitrification is kind of another one. Nitrification is the process where ammonia is not perfect for plants. It can be absorbed by plants. Some of it is, but it's not perfect. So it's oxidized to make nitrate. Nitrate, and nitrite. And the forms these are the most usable forms by plants. These are the ones that they can absorb easily through the roots and utilize inside making molecules of the plant. And some other things that help with this, again, are 2 groups of microorganisms that are involved with this nitrification process, kind of converting the ammonia to nitrite or nitrate. And these are the nitrosomonas, oxidize the ammonia to nitrite in water, and then nitrobacter actually oxidize the nitrite to nitrate. So nitrate is probably the best usable form, but it can absorb nitrite and nitrate and use it in plants. The word assimilation, here's the next word, assimilation, actually is a term that basically just means the plants can take it in and use it. So nitrates are the form of nitrogen most commonly assimilated. Like I said, nitrates are the best form. And they are taken through, or assimilated, taken up through the root hairs, and then used by plants to make amino acids, oils, nucleic acids, etc. Now, rains and extensive irrigation, so like too much work by farmers or too much irrigation can lead to those nitrates and nitrites leaving or entering the groundwater, and then that can actually have some negative impacts on humans and interfere with the blood oxygen levels, causing blue baby syndrome, things like that. But it also can lose those from plants, and that's not a good thing as well. So assimilation is an important part. Have to be able to, the roots of those plants have to be able to take up that nitrite or nitrate specifically to do some different things to build those organic molecules. So that brings us to where we've got the nitrogen in the plant itself. Okay. Now, when a plant dies, that's doing good things. It's assimilation. It's got all the nitrogen it needs. When the plant dies, or an animal after it's eaten the plant and already obtained that nitrogen inside the body, when it dies or excretes, it actually releases some of that nitrogen. As it does this, more bacteria work on breaking that back down, fungus or bacteria, breaking that organic nitrogen down back and turning it back into ammonia, which is ammonification. So nitrification is kind of, a nitrogen fixation is turning things, nitrogen gas into ammonia, whereas, turning it into ammonia, and then ammonification is actually taking the organic nitrogen and turning it into ammonification. So that's kind of a couple different terms there that could get confused there. Denitrification is the process where the nitrates are reduced to a gaseous nitrogen. So nitrification, taking those, turning into more usable forms. Denitrification, turning them back into a gas. And this process is done by what we call facultative anaerobes, which means they're not obligatory anaerobes. They don't have to be without oxygen, but if they have oxygen around, they're probably not going to use it. And these organisms do flourish in aerobic environments, but are also capable of breaking down oxygen-containing compounds like nitrate to obtain oxygen in the anaerobic environments. And again, one of the examples of this is fungi and also the bacteria Pseudomonas. So that's a heavily type of bacteria that does the denitrification process. So here's kind of the overall effects. I think I covered most of this today as far as nitrogen goes. Yeah. So effects of excess nitrogen. If we've got fossil fuel combustion has contributed sevenfold to increasing nitrogen oxides in the atmosphere, which is usually N2 or NO2, NO3, to the atmosphere, particularly nitrogen dioxide, mostly NO2 is the big one. And that is a precursor of the troposphere, the lower atmosphere, that ozone production, and contributes to smog, acid rain, and some other big heavy pollutants that could harm humans. Ammonia, NH3, as the atmosphere has tripled as a result of human activity since the Industrial Revolution, and ammonia acts as an aerosol and decreases air quality. So because of industry, we've released ammonia into the atmosphere as well. Nitrous oxide, N2O, is a significant greenhouse gas that has deleterious effects in the stratosphere, which basically means it breaks down ozone, which is not a good thing. And so we'll talk about that in chapter 19 with ozone depletion. And then human activity, I would say, has more than doubled as far as the annual transfer of nitrogen from biological availability forms through a bunch of different things, like biomass burning, so basically burning wood, things like that. Cattle and feedlots produces lots of nitrogen. Industrial processes, extensive use of chemical fertilizers, all these things have led to excess nitrogen in areas where they're not normally seen. So that is the small gist of the nitrogen cycle. The next one is the phosphorus cycle, and this is a relatively easy cycle. For the most part, it's very short and sweet. Your book also has, or the newer edition of the Barron's book has a better imagery of the cycle, but for the most part, phosphorus isn't found in the atmosphere, but it's mostly found in cell membranes, bones, teeth, shell, but it doesn't really like the atmosphere whatsoever, so it's going to stay out of it as much as possible. It is found in the form of phosphate or hydrogen phosphate, HPO4, and phosphorus is slowly released in terrestrial rocks by weathering, either by acid rain or wind and things like that. It then dissolves in the soil, taken up by plants, and is often a limiting factor as far as plant growth. if it's too low concentration or insolubility. So phosphorus is the key element in fertilizer. It actually makes up 24% of fertilizers as far as it goes. So it's anything that's labeled 6, 24, 26. The 24 is phosphorus, 6 is nitrogen, and 26 is actually potassium. So it is a key component in fertilizers. Humans have impacted the phosphorus cycle in a couple different ways. The biggest one is that they mine large quantities of rocks that contain phosphorus for inorganic fertilizers and detergents, kind of pulling them out of the rock and already putting them into the water system. Second, clear-cutting tropical habitats for agriculture, decrease the amount of available phosphorus as it is contained in vegetation. And then third, humans allow runoff from feedlots, from fertilizers and discharge into the rivers, lakes, and streams, causing huge growth or algal blooms, which is a bad thing. So those kind of the major components of the phosphorus cycle. Next cycle we're going to look at is a little bit more intensive. This is the sulfur cycle. This edition of the book doesn't have nearly as much as the newer edition, which leads me to believe that the sulfur cycle is probably going to be a very heavily tested question in the upcoming AP exam. So the sulfur cycle, again, the majority of it is found in underground rocks. It's commonly found in underground deposits, usually near hot springs or volcanoes. It's also found in a combined form of many minerals as well. Okay, so it's found in lots of different stuff, but mostly found in rock. So sulfur kind of starts out in the lithosphere itself, which is the rock layers. It's the 13th most abundant element of the Earth's crust and the 9th most abundant in sediments. So sulfur contents of rocks vary considerably. Sedimentary obviously has the most sulfur, whereas igneous might have the least. But sulfur in the lithosphere is mobilized by, again, weathering of rock materials or mining, and dissolved in runoff. It moves with the river, the water, deposits in the continental shelf sediments in the oceans, and eventually kind of builds up to make a geologic time scale there, completing that geological part of the sulfur cycle. So once let's say it's solid, let's say it's broken apart, weathered down, and it enters the hydrosphere, which is obviously the water cycle or the water part. Main storage units of the sulfur is in oceans and through dissolved surface sulfate. So the most volatile sulfur compound in seawater is dimethyl sulfide, or DMS is another word for it. And the chemical combination is CH3, and there's 2 of those molecules, and then sulfur combined to it, which is produced by algae and bacterial decay. And its highest concentration is in coastal marshes, where a lot of that decomposition is actually occurring. And also in wetlands. Sulfur is the second most abundant compound in rivers, with concentrations fluctuating highly with the seasons and also frequency of droughts. And so obviously more water, it's going to be more diluted, things like that. Rivers transport about 110 million tons of sulfur per year. So once it gets deposited, and let's say it's either in the soil or taken up by animals, as far as in the form of plants, sulfur is a major essential nutrient in the biosphere and is concentrated mainly in the soil, where it enters the biosphere through plant uptake. So plants pull it up. Its main sources are deposition from the atmosphere, coming out of the atmosphere, or weathering of rocks releasing from decay and organic matter, and then, like I said, condensing into the soil. Also, it's in fertilizer as well, but a very, very small component. Pesticides and irrigation water also have it in there as well. In soil, its presence is really in the form of SO4, which is sulfate. Rich organic soils may have up to about 0.5% sulfur just by dry weight. So by dry weighting it all, no water involved, it's 0.5% sulfur. Sulfur in the soil may be bound or unbound form as organic or inorganic compounds. And it says organic sulfur being the most prevalent, plants take up sulfur from the soil mainly as sulfate, and it's passed on with the food chain in the biosphere. It leaves the biosphere by the death of living organisms. When aerobic decay happens and decomposition, things turn it back into sulfate, and then go back into the soil. So it's kind of it hangs out in the soil quite a bit there. Finally, anaerobic decomposition of the soil releases part of it in the form of hydrogen sulfide, H2S, or dimethyl sulfide, CH3, 2 of those in S, and other organic compounds into the atmosphere, so it releases it out there. The release of sulfur is dependent upon warmer temperatures. The warmer the temperatures, the more sulfur that's going to be released. Okay. So like, let's break it down into the different types of sulfur. Now this doesn't have this on your screen, but it does in the new edition of the Barron's book. And here's a couple of the different types of sulfur in the atmosphere. One of them is carbonyl sulfide, COS, which is the most abundant sulfur species, or I don't know how to call it a species. It's not living, but component or chemical compound in the atmosphere, and in nature is mainly produced by decomposition processes in soil, marshes, wetlands, and along ocean coasts and areas of the ocean upwellings. It has a lifetime of 44 years, which with only sink being the stratosphere and hanging out there, and can end up having photochemical reactions in the troposphere, and is a big pollution problem as far as smog goes. So carbonyl sulfide is one. The next one is carbon disulfide, CS2. It's a far more reactive chemical compound than COS, the carbonyl sulfide, and has a similar sources though. It only has a lifetime of 12 days, and its major sink is, again, photochemical reactions, a type of smog, which is why we're kind of discussing this. Dimethyl sulfide, CH3, two of those, and then sulfur combined together, or DMS as it's known, is released from oceans in much greater amounts than COS or CS2, and it's rapidly oxidized to form sulfur dioxide, or is redeposited back into the oceans. In the sulfur cycle, most of the nitrogen gas released from the form of ocean is in the form of DMS. And its highest concentrations are during the night, which is kind of interesting. The last one is hydrogen sulfide, H2S. It's mainly produced in nature during anaerobic decay in soils, wetlands, and salt marshes, and other areas of stagnant water, with maximum concentrations occurring over tropical rainforests. There's a couple more. The next one is number 5, which is a sulfur dioxide. It's the natural source is oxidation of H2S, and its major anthropogenic source is the combustion of fossil fuels. So here's how we have impacted it a little bit more by burning fossil fuels, specifically coal, because coal usually has the highest sulfur content of any non-renewable resource. Over 90% of sulfur dioxide is from anthropogenic sources, while half of the global SO2 or sulfur dioxide originates from natural sources. The lifetime is 2 to 4 days, indicating losses due to photochemical conversion, again helping with photochemical smog. And finally, the last one, I promise this time, is sulfate aerosol, which is SO4. And the largest natural source of sulfate is of aerosol particles originating from sea spray. So actually the salt spray coming up out of the oceans. About 3.3 million tons per year of sulfate is added to the atmosphere from anthropogenic sources directly, but much greater amounts in the form of secondary reactions from various sulfur species in the atmosphere. So sulfate aerosol is a kind of byproducts from being rearranged again when humans are inputting sulfur of different types into the atmosphere. Okay, so that is the sulfur cycle. Again, same image right here as you have in the more recent edition, kind of showing you all those different things. But again, the biggest one is that it's bound up in water. I'm sorry, bound up in water, not bound up in water, bound up in rock, and then is obviously mined. That's another way of burning fossil fuels that we impact the sulfur cycle. All right, and the final cycle is the easiest of them all, because you probably remember about this from since you were in middle school or elementary school. This is the water cycle, aka the hydrologic cycle. A water cycle is powered by energy from the sun, solar energy, evaporating water from lakes, oceans, rivers, streams, soil, even vegetation through transpiration. That kind of stimulates the whole cycle to go. The oceans hold 97% of the water on the planet and 78% of all global precipitation. And oceans are also a source of 86% of the global evaporation as well, with evaporation from the sea surface keeping the Earth from overheating, which is a good thing. If there were no oceans, the temperatures could rise to 153 degrees Fahrenheit, which is crazy hot, way too hot for us. And so we're thankful the oceans are here. The water cycle is the state of dynamic equilibrium, which basically means it's good to have the portions that we do in different areas. Warm air holds more water vapor than cold air, when cold air usually forces that water to enter back to the earth. Processes involved in the water cycle are evaporation, going from liquid to a gas, evapotranspiration, liquid from gas in leaves and plants, condensation, gas to a liquid, infiltration, that's water moving through the soil, going and percolating through the soil, getting down to groundwater, runoff, water from the surface of the earth down to where it is held in larger quantities in oceans or lakes. And then also precipitation, condensing from in the atmosphere, going from a gas to a liquid and falling down to our atmosphere. Okay, so that's the water cycle. And that is kind of, there's some other impacts in the water cycle. Obviously, withdrawing water from lakes and aquifers, that's what we've talked about. We'll get into this a little bit more, but as we most of our water comes from aquifers. As we pull those out, subsidence can occur. Lateral entry from salt water can actually enter ours and causing our aquifers to be depleted, at least as far as fresh water goes. Clearing of land and for agriculture and urbanization, you're going to increase runoff and can increase pollution of water and excel some soil erosion, which can cause turbidity of the water itself. And then agriculture runoff containing nitrates, phosphates, ammonia, that's going to cause some major changes in the chemical composition of the water. Destruction of wetlands, disturbing that natural process that actually purifies the water. Natural wetlands are a great filter for water to filter out pollutants. And then pollution of water sources increasing because of different biological pathogens, as they say, cholera and dysentery. Sewage runoff is another one. Feedlot runoff causing culture eutrophication, causing lakes or lentic bodies of water going from oligotrophic to hyper-eutrophic, which is not a good thing. And then building new power plants, increasing thermal pollution, and actually changing the temperature of water can be very bad for the ecosystem and organisms living in those as well. So conservation of matter and energy is one law they state in there. The law of conservation of matter states that during the ordinary chemical change, there is no detectable increase or decrease in the quantity of matter. The total quantity of matter of energy available in the universe is a fixed amount, so it's just change. So the law of conservation of energy states that the energy cannot be created or destroyed, but can change form as well. And conversion of one type of matter into another is always accompanied by the conversion from one form to another. And usually it is heat that's given off. It's not necessarily lost. It's just changed to heat, which is not usually a usable form of energy. And so that's kind of the difference between matter and energy there. I definitely encourage you to review the checklist. Look at make sure you've got all those things down pat. Teach it to your dog. Teach it to your sister, or someone who can't even speak back to you. Teach it to the wall. I don't care, but go over it. And then give it these next questions a shot. There are 20 questions there, and also a free response question looks like on fertilizer. So definitely try these out. Give them your best shot. If you guys have any questions, don't forget on the sidebar there, as you look at the website and you drag it over, it should show a little blog area that you can post any questions. I'd be happy to answer any questions you have. So we'll see you guys next time, and good luck.